You're listening to
Real Mysteries.
Episode 9. The State Trial Process.
I'm Brenda Bennett, your host on realmysteries.us. Today we're discussing the state of Oklahoma versus Terry Nichols trial and why it was undertaken when Nichols had already been given a sentence of life without parole in the federal trial. Sandra Elliott, Assistant District Attorney in Oklahoma County, shared her thoughts and memories with us. She was the lead prosecutor in the case. Here's that interview with Real Mysteries producer Ken Sarkey.
Sandy Elliott, thank you for joining us today on Real Mysteries.
You're welcome.
Tell us about the state of Oklahoma's case against Terry Nichols and how you got involved with it.
Because our building was closed for the first week after the bombing. They evacuated everybody out that day, and we weren't allowed to come back in until about a week later. So Bob Macy, who was the district attorney at the time, had an office-wide meeting, giving us some kind of a rundown of what they knew at that point. He indicated that it didn't really matter what happened on the federal side of the prosecution, that he intended from the very first moment to go forward with the state prosecution after the bombing happened. So when he called us all together, he explains that to us, and then he selected, I think there were 5 of us, to be on the prosecution team for the state trials. And I was one of the ones that he selected.
Former Oklahoma County District Attorney Wes Lane, who would lead the state of Oklahoma trial against Terry Nichols, had this to say in our recent interview with him.
During the period of time of the actual federal prosecutions of Nichols and McVeigh, those were done while Bob Macy was the district attorney. And as, of course, McVeigh was given the death penalty and Nichols was not, though he was found guilty of conspiracy, he was convicted of an involuntary manslaughter, which was deeply frustrating to any number of folks. And so my boss, Bob Macy, then began a Herculean effort to bring the state charges against Nichols. And he was successful in doing that. He filed 160 plus counts of murder, including a total of 168 and 3 unborn children. And the federal prosecution had involved 8.
And then when Mr. Macy retired from the office, Wes Lane was appointed, and the bombing case was still pending. So I remember distinctly Mr. Lane coming into the office and saying, "Do you think we ought to proceed on this case?" And at that time, there were 3 of us, I think, assigned to the bombing prosecution. And I think Mr. Lane was faced with a public, at least the loud part of the public, saying we shouldn't be expending this kind of money on a trial when this guy's already been convicted.
So by the time I became district attorney on July 1 of 2001, Terry Nichols was sitting in the Oklahoma County Jail. And truth be told, it had not been my original intent to follow through with that. And there were a myriad number of reasons for that. And my concern was that in Oklahoma County, we were really overburdened by murder cases. We were losing a lot of experienced staff. And so it was highly controversial at the time that Mr. Macy had filed the state charges. And when I became district attorney, I could not go any place in this town, and I'm not exaggerating. I could go no place in the town in which somebody wasn't interrupting me or confronting me to give me a piece of their mind or their 2 cents worth on the prosecution of Terry Nichols. By this time, McVeigh had already been executed. There was a reason for pursuing the state case in the first place. What people did not realize was that the federal cases were focused on 8 federal agents. And what I did not realize, and what utterly changed my mind, was meeting with the victims' family members.
I remember that we sent out a notice to all of the victims' families, and we met out at the training center for the police department with as many victims and their families who wanted to come and sit and listen. And Mr. Lane put it to them, to the victims as a whole, and said, "What would you like for me to do? And if you want me to proceed, tell me why."
What never had crossed my mind, and one reason why I was rather opposed to the pursuit of the case was thinking this was just a kind of a bloodlust deal. They're just wanting his head. They're ticked that Nichols didn't get the death penalty. And I'm thinking about all of the homicide cases that we've got to try in Oklahoma County that we're really overburdened with. And how are we going to do that, plus the Nichols case? Until I realized that was not the point. The point for these people, and as they pointed out to me, is that they they felt like they had never had justice done for theirs. As one person said, so when is someone going to be held accountable for the death of my mother? That was such a foreign thought to me. And then I realized these people aren't bloodthirsty. They are wanting justice. And my boss, Bob Macy, had promised them, and now I think I understand why he did. And so I had a total change of heart.
And the vast majority of the victims, now not everybody, it was clearly not unanimous, but the vast majority of the victims said, we want you to go forward, because nobody had been prosecuted for the death of their individual loved one.
Right.
Because the federal prosecution was only about the 8 federal agents. So for the vast majority of the victims, it was a chance for them to have their loved one's life vindicated in a courtroom. And so I think that thing alone is what prompted Mr. Lane to continue with the prosecution. I think he was concerned about not going forward just because there was such a public outcry about the expense of the trial. But after meeting with the victims, he was wholeheartedly on board. He didn't really take part in the actual prosecution of the case. I mean, other than as my supervisor. I mean, he didn't do any of the courtroom work, didn't do any of the motions, but he's the one who kept it going after Mr. Macy retired and left office. So, but he did it with the input from the victims.
And so that begins the long and arduous process of getting a conviction. And it is not easy, and particularly when it's not a popular thing.
Sandy, with the Denver federal trials of McVeigh and later Nichols, you had the opportunity to be there, is that right?
I did.
Well, that must have been quite advantageous to observe and learn from those proceedings.
Yeah, absolutely. From day to day, I was able to see every piece of physical evidence that was introduced and how it was relevant, how it fit into the overall picture of the case. I got to see every witness testify. I could get a feel for how well they answered questions under direct and cross-examination. It just gave me just a general oversight of what the theory of the case was and how the evidence all fit together. So for us, it was invaluable because even though the FBI kept us, we had like monthly or bi-monthly meetings with them for them to kind of run down what was going on. We didn't really get a lot of specifics until after the federal trials were over. We just kind of would get generalities. So me attending the trials made a huge difference in our ability to get prepared once the feds were done with them.
So then things proceeded to the state of Oklahoma's case.
Yes.
Now that trial took, 2 years to make it to court?
Well, I think the federal trials were over, I'm not sure what year, but we actually started the trial itself in 2004 here in Oklahoma. But I think we had suffered several delays, which are pretty natural in a death penalty case. So I think we may have had it actually in our court for a period of about 3 to 4 years before we actually got to trial.
I would imagine that a delay like that would have some effect on the witnesses' memories and their testimonies.
Sure. I mean, even folks who come to court 4 or 5 months after something happens have a hard time remembering details of a particular event. But for us, luckily, and thanks to the federal government and the federal prosecutors, we really had a roadmap on how to prosecute the case. We had all the transcripts from the federal trial, all of the reports from the FBI investigation. So for us, in terms of getting prepared for trial, they really just hand-delivered it to us, with a ribbon on it. So it really wasn't as difficult as a lot of cases go, other than just the sheer volume of FBI reports and transcripts and evidence that we had to look over. It was pretty well packaged for us.
Now, I'm a native Oklahoman, and I can just hardly imagine the impact of a trial on McAllister, and because I read there's like 1,000 jurors in the pool, summoned from a population of 40,000.
Yeah, I think it was a difficult time picking a jury, and a lot because I think there was so much publicity and there was so much responsibility placed on the shoulders of those people involved. I think either way the jury would have gone, it was going to be difficult just because everybody understood how important the case was to the state as a whole.
Right. And only ended up, I think, with 3 alternates?
Yeah, I think we had, it's been so long. I think it was 3 alternates, and we ended up having to pull 2 of them onto the jury.
I was thinking about this. As the lead prosecutor in the case, you got to know some of the survivors and family members of the victims and their stories. What's it like to represent the many victims of a deliberate bombing attack?
Well, it was a pleasure. I have to say, all of them were so gracious and so kind. But a lot of them I still have contact with. To this day, I still get phone calls from the Hawthorne family out in Arizona. Diane, her last name's not Leonard now, but Diane Leonard calls me occasionally, so I still have contact with some of them. They are all the most wonderful people, the most gracious people, and how they're able to do that, considering what they've been through, I'll never know, but they're great people.
So you told us about the massive amount of evidence available to present, along with so many witnesses you could call upon. What can you tell us about the testimonies of Michael Fortier and Terry Nichols' wife, Lana Padilla?
Well, I can tell you that we did bring Michael Fortier in, and he did testify at the trial, and I was the one who examined Mr. Fortier when he was on the stand, and it was a difficult process because he was very close to being released. I mean, he was within a year or so of being released on his federal sentence when we got him here to testify. So he was a little bit difficult. I'll tell you, luckily we had the transcripts from the federal trial, so I really had him boxed in as to what he could and couldn't say. But I don't have a lot of sympathies for Mr. Fortier. I mean, I recognize that the deals that were made with Mr. Fortier had to be done, but I didn't get a real strong feeling from Mr. Fortier that he really had a lot of remorse about what had happened. Miss Padilla, kind of the same way, I think. She came because she was forced to come. She wasn't wanting to be cooperative. Of course, that's the father of her child, so I get that somewhat. But I didn't really get a strong sense of any remorse from her either. So they were both difficult witnesses. Luckily for us, the federal government had already boxed them in, so as a result of that, I was able to box them in.
So did the defense try to make an issue of John Doe number 2 and other conspiracy theories?
Sure, absolutely, because their whole theory was there was a John Doe number 2 other than Mr. Nichols. Their whole theory was that Mr. Nichols was a dupe of Mr. McVeigh's, that Mr. Nichols didn't know anything about what was going on, that Mr. McVeigh was just kind of using him like he used everybody else. So, I mean, we had to fight that battle all along as well. But just, based on every report that I ever read, every interview that I did, there is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that other than the Fortiers, Mr. Nichols, and Mr. McVeigh, that nobody else was involved in blowing up our federal building.
I have referred many times to a book I read back in 2004 that gives an amazingly detailed account of the Oklahoma City bombing investigation. It's called Simple Truths, and it was written by FBI investigators John Hersley and Larry Tongate, along with Bob Burke. They tell the story of finding a Fort Riley soldier who happened to rent a Ryder truck at the same place McVeigh did on the very next day, and he had a friend with him.
And one of them looks astoundingly like Mr. McVeigh.
Yes, and the other guy fit the description of John Doe number 2 and was indeed wearing exactly what was described for the FBI sketches. The photo's in that book, and that seemed to explain it to me.
Yes.
Okay, so we get down towards the closing statements and so forth. How difficult is it to get a guilty verdict and convince a jury of what they need to do?
Yeah. It's difficult in any criminal case because, as I'm sure you know, criminal convictions require that the verdict be unanimous. All 12 jurors must agree on a verdict, and it's hard enough to get 12 people to agree where they want to go for lunch, let alone holding
Right.
somebody guilty of 160 counts of first-degree murder. So it's difficult always, just because it's difficult to get 12 people to agree on anything. But we also have to deal with, and did in this case in particular, deal with concerns about whether or not jurors were honest with us in their ability to be fair in judging the facts of that particular case. We ask them questions in voir dire. They're supposed to answer truthfully, but at the end of the day, we never know if they're actually answering truthfully. We just have to kind of rely on what they tell us and our gut reaction to that. So, and particularly in a case like Mr. Nichols, where it was high profile, the press was interested in it, the public was interested in it. There are jurors who wanted to be there, who wanted to be on that jury, and I think some who may have said whatever they thought it would take to get on the jury and to be able to stay on it. So, at the end of the day, though, with all that being said, I think on this particular case, the bombing case, I think the evidence was so overwhelming against Mr. Nichols that I can't remember a time when I was ever really concerned that they wouldn't find him guilty. It was just, I think the evidence was just overwhelming of his guilt. So I was never really worried about that.
So you weren't surprised it only took about 4 hours to deliberate?
No, that's not uncommon at all.
What were some of the difficulties associated with obtaining a death sentence? You mentioned got to be unanimous decision.
Right. Well, and of course, we didn't receive the death penalty on Mr. Nichols because the jury deadlocked, and that's kind of one of those deals where, at least me personally, and I don't have a crystal ball, and I can't tell what jurors were actually thinking. Mm-hmm. But I do think that some of the jurors at the beginning of the process because we always have to ask. One of the questions you always have to ask is, do you feel like you're strong enough if you think that death is the appropriate verdict? Do you feel strong enough that you could actually do that? Can you vote for that sentence? And of course, they all say yes, but sometimes they may even think that they can do it, and then after the process begins and they've already been selected, I think sometimes jurors discover they don't have the strength to do what they think is actually the right thing, so they do what is the easiest thing, which is, I'm not going to vote for that. And so getting a guilty verdict is generally easier than getting a penalty of death. And of course, on ours, the jury hung on the penalty, and so the judge had to take it away from them. And by law, he's required to sentence him to life or life without parole. The judge can't sentence him to death. So our judge, Judge Taylor, then sentenced him to life without parole, all the different counts consecutively, which was the best that we could have hoped for after the jury hung.
The verdict and sentence were never appealed. The Fortiers had been able to work a deal with the federal prosecutors because of the value of their testimonies in court, even though it would show their involvement in the crime. Lori Fortier was granted immunity, and Michael Fortier was sentenced to 12 years in prison, along with a $200,000 fine.
Living here in Oklahoma County, I've served twice now as a juror, so I'm thankful to have that look inside the courtroom, and I did serve on 2 cases. In fact, one was a bomb threat, and I served as the foreman of the jury, so I came away with a real respect for the whole process, be it as it is. Mm-hmm. And so here we are 20 years later. Is our legal system and justice system still about the same as it was in 95, or have there been some other beneficial changes to the trial processes implemented?
I think it's really essentially the same. I'm trying to think of any big legislation that's come through since then, and I don't really think there's been any huge change in the way that we do criminal cases at all. I do think that today, 20 years down the road, there may be a bit of a softening in terms of how we handle the offenders. At one point we were kind of a law and order state, and if you did the crime, you better be ready to do the time, and we're sending you to prison. Things have kind of softened up a little bit since then. But other than that, I don't really see there being a whole lot of difference between our system then and our system now.
Well, thank you so much for your insight to these things that happened years ago that, for whatever reasons, people are still interested in, and it has had such an impact on our state and our citizens.
Well, you're welcome. Glad to do it.
In our next episode, we'll hear more from Phil Bacharach, a journalist who received letters from Timothy McVeigh while he was in prison. We'll take a look at the criminal mind and motivation as we ask the question, are we any safer today than we were in 1995? We have some very interesting observations by David Sid, a former FBI counterterrorism specialist, and from others who we've interviewed. Again, we'd like to thank you for listening and for your responses. We'd love to hear your comments, questions, and suggestions, so be sure to do that on our realmysteries.us website. It also has our links to our Facebook and Twitter accounts, plus other great photos and documents that we've been discussing over these past several episodes. I'm Brenda Bennett, and this is realmysteries.us.